Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you so much for tuning into one of our talks today. I'm so thrilled today to be joined by the fantastically talented Lucia Aniello to talk all about HBO Max's Hacks. She is the co-creator, executive producer, and director on the show. And I wanted to dive straight in by talking about the opening shot because it's so incredible and it does so many things in just a couple of minutes of screen time, and everything that it tells us about Deborah as a character, everything that it tells us about the voice and tone of the show, mixing between drama and comedy, and the way that you kind of gradually introduce us to so many facets of her world really quickly. And was it always something that was very clear to you from the beginning that the camera tracking was always going to go from behind and then be that gradual reveal of her face? And also I was just interested in overall the process of actually logistically putting it together, because it's one tracking shot but made of a few different shots stitched together.
Yeah. So, firstly, the shot was always scripted to be starting behind her to reveal at the mirror. So that's something that we'd been thinking about for at least a year before we shot it. And yeah, we wanted it to the shot. The idea was just like you're kind of introduced to this larger than life person. And so by showing her in her space, whether it's on stage and as she walks off stage, to kind of build the mystique and the myth before you actually reveal Jean's face, for us was kind of like the best way to show, don't tell. And yeah, the shot is stitched into it's two pieces. One that starts in the Ebell Theater behind her, and then as it moves, it reveals a couple of things. One, the idea that she's very super specific about how her show goes and things. And that is actually something that I talked a lot about the Lady Gaga documentary, 5'2". I don't know if you've ever seen it, but when she's talking about like being at the Super Bowl and how the sleeve needs to fit in perfectly. And it's just the detail that these kind of super incredible performers delve into on a daily basis and really force the rest of their crew to be hyper attentive to. And so she talks about the shoes, about the grip on the shoes. She talks about the heaviness of the earrings, and all that stuff is kind of getting disrobed from her as she walks. And so that was kind of important for us to say, this is somebody who is really specific about how she performs and wants everybody to be on the same page as her. And then we kind of move into the area where she sees Bill, this stagehand guy, and she talks about his wife, and then she says hi to the showgirls. And that for us was just that, like, she remembers everyone's name. She knows everyone in this world. This is a world she's been in for a long time. And she makes sure to have real relationships with these people, even if they're just like remembering their name or their wife's name or whatever. And then right around there is when we actually have the stitch, when it goes from backstage into the hallway. And the camera kind of, I hope you can't really super tell, but right, she kind of leaves frame for just, I think it's like 4 frames or something. And then we were able to match to her step pretty nicely there. And then that's when she encounters Marcus, who is her COO, Chief Creative Officer of her business. And he updates her on the flight that they're about to take that night. And then she interacts with Damien, who's her personal assistant, who lets her know that a tapestry that she wanted in an online auction she won. And for us, this is also kind of like nodding to what we get to later in the series, which is the idea that she's constantly filling her house with objects and things because she doesn't really have people there for her. And so she kind of really fixates on her interior design. And then finally, we land at the mirror where we reveal Jean's face. She's feeling very good because she just had a great show. She raises a glass of champagne, perhaps suggesting a slight dependency on alcohol. And then she says, let's party, because that puts into sequence the shots of her, going to QVC, getting on the private plane, coming back, and basically continuing her huge grind that she's on. And then when she finally lands at home, I know you didn't ask about this part, but it's kind of what it's leading to. She gets at home, and then all of a sudden the camera is no longer fun and moving and sexy and energetic. It becomes quite static, a little bit of movement, but only really to pull back to kind of show that she's really alone in these large, ornate, gorgeous spaces, but that she's quite solitary in them. And so really wanting to make sure that the camera felt very different in that kind of first sequence versus the once she gets home sequence. And because the camera's saying basically this is now what it feels like to not be working and how lonely she is when she's not doing that. And of course, then I'm just going to talk through the whole pilot, I guess. But then when she has those dates taken away from her, or some of the dates taken away from her from Marty, who owns the casino, you already visually know that means a lot to her and what it feels like for her when she doesn't have those dates. So hopefully the idea is that through the visual storytelling, you could get an idea of what's important to her and how she's feeling in these different places.
And those shots in between where she's going to QVC and we're kind of getting a window into a lot of different spaces for her, the camera setup for those is interesting because you frequently start on a wide shot and then just very slowly pan in ever so slightly. And so it kind of sets it up for the audience and then gives us a little bit more detail. So I was really interested in the choice behind that framing.
Yeah, I mean, when you have her, like, there's a couple of shots. So when she's coming out of the casino, gets into the car, that's moving, and that's really trying to take in all of her crowd and her fans. And then I do the insert on the LV Diva one, which is kind of fun. I think she like is cheeky about knowing her diva-ness, and that has a little bit of a push to it as well. And then, yeah, when we get to the plane, to the tarmac in Vegas, I wanted to have something really wide that establishes the tarmac and the plane in Vegas in the background, but then it does cut in a little bit more to find her in that space. And then when we're at QVC, I really wanted to show QVC in a really fun way. So we start on like the super insert of the monitor and then quickly move up to see the space, and then it cuts in again. And that one was partially for the reveal, but once I get past the reveal, I really was just trying to have really exciting, fun shots and cuts that also had the funniest moments, because the two of them are so funny. Gene Smart with Cara Louise. But in any case, so yeah. And then once she gets back on the off the plane, we actually have a tracking profile, kind of wide, medium wide, that just again shows her chatting with her employees, but I also really wanted to have some kind of a different framing. And so being able to use the hanger to like kind of be super bright and then see her a little bit of the silhouette through it. I just wanted to just be like really visually striking. And yeah, so there's actually quite a lot of like, here's the space, here's her in it, but it's like cameras moving, so it still feels exciting. But I felt that would be the most concise way to kind of like say what the story is very quickly, because I really didn't want to hang on the sequence too long, because we have a lot of story to get through the pilot. So trying to strike the balance between cool visual shots that also and that tell the story, but also not overstay their welcome was a bit of a challenge actually in the edit.
Yeah. And camera-wise, when you look at the two characters of Ava and Deborah, there's a little bit more of a staticness to the camera motion that we see on Deborah, and then it's a little bit more handheld once Ava comes in to show the kind of like separation and juxtaposition of them as characters before they have that connectivity. But how did you set about having these two different styles and making sure that they melded together and still really worked collaboratively, stylistically on screen?
Yeah, we wanted the camera, and me and the DP, Adam Bricker, really talked a lot about wanting to make sure that then when you were introduced to Ava's story, that we wanted it to feel a bit more modern. And so for that, we had it being a little bit more handheld, but we still wanted to make sure that it felt like she's also still alone, even if we're not necessarily doing as many hyper composed shots. So the very first shot you see is her in profile against the landscape of Los Angeles, again, feeling very alone and disconnected to kind of anybody. She then sits down and has a conversation with her manager, which is a little bit more handheld, partly because I ended up cross shooting that sequence, but also partly because it didn't want to feel like this is just like her daily life and what she's dealing with. But in terms of being able to know that tonally they would intercut, it really kind of, I think, even though it is a little bit more composed, a little bit more handheld, by keeping her still very much like disconnected. Like, for example, when you see the shot of over Jimmy's shoulder of her sitting on a chair in the manager's office, like smoking her vape, she's again very alone and by herself. So it is mimicking a couple of the shots that we had from Deborah, like center frame, wide shot, alone. So by being able to kind of use that visual motif over and over, and then being able to, once we finally get them together, to have those shots suddenly be in tighter lenses and really have super dirty. So like we're seeing a full head and like very, very little empty space in those frames. Now I think we're able to say like, these are two people who are finally eye to eye and are really have finally somebody who can like speak their language and are at their level, and they're not letting each other off the hook. And I think that's a really big thing for the two of them, is they kind of keep prodding. Well, especially Deborah keeps prodding Ava, but Ava doesn't like let go and doesn't, she doesn't even leave the room, they're still kind of there. If anything, that to me is like a really, that sequence is like shot more like it's like a love scene or two characters who are like, it's almost more of a meet cute, but it's almost like a horror meet cute or something. But just the idea that they're finally like somebody's finally filling the frame with the other.
And when you were writing,
it kind of makes sense.
It really
the words didn't make sense, but you get the idea.
Yeah. When you were all writing the scripts, there's obviously so many delicious moments of antagonism and conflict between the two of them. And yet it never feels like it leans too heavily because you're constantly dancing back and forth between conflict and connectivity and linearity between the two of them. And was that something that was easy to find in terms of the flow of what the dynamic with these two characters were? Or was it a little bit of a dance when you were writing the scripts and figuring out when and where the conflict needed to lay and how much you wanted to go into it before you needed to pull it back a little bit tonally?
Yeah, it's, I wouldn't say it's always a challenge, but it's always something we have an eye on, because in the end, like the characters have to have both. They basically, for us, we're like, they constantly are hitting heads, but then in that process of hitting heads, you start to see the cracks. And then in those cracks, you start to see them seep into one another. And I think that's the satisfying part, right? But you don't get the satisfying part of starting to see them affect each other unless you really have the butting of heads. But we never wanted it to feel, we always wanted it to be mean, but never cruel. Like it's almost, in a way, it's like a love language between them. So you always have to make sure it feels fun, even if there is antagonism. And even if it, is straight up antagonistic, like when she says, well, I'm finally starting to see why your husband left you for your own sister. There's no, I don't want to say there's a lot of love behind that, but there is a spark. And I think that's the thing, is whether they're laughing together or whether they're, arguing, as long as you still have that spark, I think it's still fun to watch. And, but yeah, it's still something that we never wanted to be so like eye rolly, like boomer versus zoomer arguing about this thing. But then again, it really feels also hyper realistic that like, I mean, argue with my parents about something, and like, it's like, well, that's not how it is now or whatever. So like, it is real. I mean, I'm not a zoomer, but it is, on one hand, like you want it to be authentic and real, but on the other hand, you don't want to make it one note. So having their relationship shift out over the course of the season and seeing how therefore their arguments and conversations would then also shift tonally just a little bit, but also then want to retreat to, of course, Deborah makes fun of her hands or whatever it is, being able to have like a little bit of the classics while still being able to evolve their relationship and how they talk to each other. It's I think a fun thing to watch their relationship evolve and to watch their conversations evolve.
Yeah, it really is. And when it comes to Deborah's comedic voice, there's such an art form to writing stand-up comedy to begin with, and then writing stand-up comedy scenes within a show, because it can't just be about delivering a punchline. It's also got to give character exposition. It's also moving the narrative forward as well. And then taking it a step further with her character, you also had to figure out the voice of, okay, this is someone who has had a career, is very funny, but there's a little bit of dust on the jokes and maybe they haven't been updated in a while. So how did you all figure out all of those elements for the scenes and what that comedic voice needed to be for her?
Yeah, it was a lot of trial and error and writing a ton of jokes. And I think that it's interesting because you also have that side of it, the like seeing what her jokes are like now and doing her jokes about, oh yeah, I watch porn in reverse because then it's about being rewarded for sex with a pizza and that stuff, it is funny. But then you also have the stuff in episode 3, especially where you see her older material, especially her late night pilot, which really is supposed to be like, actually, this was fresh and really edgy and funny for the time. And so you really have to write different versions of Deborah's jokes, but kind of knowing like, okay, it has to be good, but not so good that there isn't a reason for Ava to be there. And it needs to be a little bit, as you said, dusty, but still good, dusty. And now it needs to be actually authentically good for the time, which needs to like have certain references that make sense for the kinds of jokes and like have the audience reaction be a certain way based on the time. It's like, it was very, yeah, it's something that like was a challenge for sure. But I do feel like you understand. I hope we did it well, but I feel like you get the almost exposition that you need through the jokes.
And I was so fascinated by the archive material and footage that you just
Yeah.
mentioned, because it was Jean creating a performance that then another actor is mimicking, and then visual effects creating a composite. Did you always know that that was how you were going to be able to pull that together, or were there different ideations around how you wanted to achieve that and what you wanted it to look like on screen?
Yeah, from my first conversations with David Neednoggle, who was our VFX supervisor, that was kind of his pitch. Was I think we can take old footage of Jean and basically get what we need from her and be able to essentially do a version of like what is known as like a deep fake for her face. But we also wanted to have like the physicality of somebody who was, in her early to mid 20s. But we also wanted Jean's voice because that really sells, the Jean of it all. So it was always kind of his pitch for how it would work. And then once I started to see like early rough drafts of what that would look like, I was like, oh, this is exactly what we need. And so Olivia Boreham Wing, who was young Jean, did an unbelievable job. I mean, this woman is amazing. Like her lip dub ability, like she's just such a skilled actor that she was able to do it so perfectly and gave us every take was perfect and just allowed us to be able to then be like, okay, great. Well, this take works best for the performance because her face isn't moving in this direction and we don't have a comp for Jean in that little angle. So let's use this one and they all work perfectly. So she really allowed us to have a lot of flexibility on the back end. But yeah, it's one of those things where like, if you don't believe the old footage, whether it's the photos or the flashback video, like if you don't believe that stuff, it just pulls you out just a little bit. And building the myth of Deborah Vance is so important to us because you have to really believe that this is who this woman is. So it's also kind of a pet peeve of mine, to be honest, the idea of just like bad Photoshop and like insert photos. I'm always like, oh God, you just feel the seams and takes you out for a second, at least takes me out. So yeah, I was really pleased with how that ended up. And of course, there's little tips and tricks for how you make sure to make it work, but can't give you everything.
Was that something that you knew very early on that you wanted to use as a form of exposition? Because in exploring Deborah's character, it's so important to have such a rich sense of her history, where she's come from, a lot of what she's gone through in the industry as well as personally. And the show does such a great job at giving us such a rich backstory of her, but without it ever feeling heavy-handed, because you've got moments like that and the way that you pepper it in the scripts in different ways.
Yeah, it was something that we always thought would be the right way to expose it because it also dovetails with Deborah saying you need to work harder and you need to go digitize this work for me. So we felt like that actually served dual purposes. But yeah, because Deborah does have this rich backstory, and we, at a certain point, talk like, well, do we want to do flashbacks? And we just felt like not really. It just didn't make as much sense for the story, but we still wanted to excavate so much of that, and so we felt like being able to use old footage would be a really interesting way to see it. And because so much of the show is saying this is a woman who's hardened and kind of crystallized herself because of so many reasons, mostly traumatic reasons. But if we don't start being like, well, why is she telling these jokes? How come she doesn't have close friends or a lot of people around her who aren't on her payroll? Well, why did she get to this point, and how did she get to this point? So it does feel like you need to be talking about it, but it's also so like not really fun to be just talking about the past. You want to be able to see it in some way, and if the flashback doesn't work, then we felt like digitizing would make sense. And I used to digitize for Comedy Central years and years ago when I was like in my early mid-20s. That was like my job. So I felt like I had a little bit of like, hey, I've done this as a job. I know what it's like, even though we did absolutely push it on like her having ripped through all that footage in such a short amount of time. But she didn't say she actually finished. She's almost finished. Anyway.
With the cast that you have, they obviously do such an incredible job at really lifting up what's on the page and finding a lot of added context through nonverbal moments in their acting. And for example, there's that one scene where you have Deborah and DJ makes the joke about the Weight Watchers thing, and it makes her mom laugh, and then you get the reaction from her, which tells you so much about their dynamic and exactly everything that it means to her to be able to make her mom laugh, and that's something that she always is striving for. And when you're working with cast that can remembering so much in just a few frames. As a director, how were you really setting about creating the space that was really conducive and giving them the tools that they needed from you, and also thinking about how you wanted to be able to just set up and capture those moments on camera when they would happen?
Yeah, I mean, luckily I didn't have to do too much in terms of setting that space for them, because they all are so talented and gifted. And I mean, that's one of the things I'm the most proud of this show is the casting, because it's something. Oh, Knives Out. um, because I do feel like I'm always, whenever I'm watching stuff, I'm like, her, she's amazing. Who is she? Or even in commercials, I'm constantly Googling who actors are in commercials or in other shows or whatever. And like just having a little database, or just like people that I'm like, oh God, I love it every time Lauren Weedman is on something. So when she, came in for Mayor Joe Pesamenti, I was like, yes. I was like, this is somebody who I loved her in 5 Year Engagement. I loved her in Looking. I'm always like, oh God, I love her. And so same with Jane Addams, same with truly so many people who came. But in any case, back to your question, I think sometimes it's something that's scripted. Sometimes they know like this is a moment where I'm supposed to have this. And sometimes it's something that we didn't even really plan on. But being able to spend the time whenever we can on, like, let's say, for example, Christopher McDonald, who plays Marty in episode 7 at the dinner table, being able to like have a camera just fully dedicated to him for the whole scene, for multiple takes. So like little moments when Deborah is like giving her speech, being able to, even if he doesn't have any dialogue for that whole section or scene, being able to just like have a camera that's dedicated to him, that like lets him allows him to like react. He's an incredible actor, but it allows him to react to DJ, allows him to react to Deborah non-verbally. Then when you go to the edit, you have a treasure trove of incredible non-verbal moments that you can use, because you're just allowing actors to be actors. And that means that they're not just funny in their lines, they're just, the actors in the moment. And so whenever we had the ability to just be like, let's just commit a camera to this person, or commit like whatever it is to that person, like, and of course we did allow, I'm very open with actors of like, hey, if you have a little line you want to throw in, or a moment or a reaction or improvised thing, I am very open to that. And I think that there's a lot of moments that are in the show that came from like allowing the actors to feel comfortable to do that. But I think because also I come from improv and I come from performing, I think people kind of have a sense that I'm not going to be hard about like just deliver the lines, and it's like I try to have a relatively fun vibe on set for the actors, even if I'm stressed out. I want them to have fun, because you can tell on camera in the end that they're having fun. And I do feel that that's true, that I think all the actors were so happy to be playing with each other and being able to, have fun. And I just really love them, and they love each other.
You also use costumes to really carry through a lot of the journey and arc and details with character as well. With Deborah, it's the fact that even when she goes home, there's still staff around. So there's almost still a public performance persona element to a lot of the outfits that she's wearing. And with Ava, you've got the fact that she's wearing much more casual clothes. And then even the fact that she puts on a dress, which isn't even that fancy of a dress. Everyone kind of reacts to it because it's so unlike everything that she's been wearing. So how did you want to journey these two characters through costume in that way?
Well, that's, Kathleen Felix Hager, who was our costume designer, did such an incredible job. I mean, when I see, the photos of the wardrobe, the fittings that she puts Deborah in, Gina in, I'm just like, where did you find this? And sometimes she finds it out of the world, and sometimes she makes it. I mean, there's a lot, like that gold outfit that Deborah wears in the finale. Kathleen custom made that for her. And it just fits her so beautifully. But yeah, I mean, Deborah loves luxury. She loves beautiful things. Jean wears things beautifully. And I think there's something very fun about how the costumes flow on her. And then you have somebody like Marcus, who's very buttoned up, but we didn't want him necessarily like in literal button up. So Kathleen did an incredible job of finding such beautiful clothes for him that fit him beautifully, but also kind of told the story of this is somebody who makes sure he goes out to the world looking really good, but also isn't so basic, also has a style and like twist on it, but isn't, just your run of the mill guy who works for her. And so, yeah. And so as for Ava, I mean, especially I feel like when you're your early or mid 20s, I think that everybody kind of is always doing vintage at that age, or at least I certainly did. Um, and so we wanted to mix in a lot of vintage with some basics that kind of felt more appropriate for her, but also really casual. And that is, like you said, part of the thing is that Deborah, especially at that age, always had to wear like a skirt and heels when she was doing stand up or whatever. And Ava so rejected the male gaze that she just wears like a grungy t-shirt and Chucks or, Doc Martens or, whatever. And so for us, it is important to be like, oh, the clothes, hopefully if you just see a snapshot of everybody in their costumes, you kind of get their characters a little bit without it feeling sketchy or broad. And that's the other thing that we wanted to make sure is that, like, Ava you'd see her in the same t-shirt a couple times because she came to Vegas quickly and didn't have a ton of clothes with her. So you might see some things repeat and yeah, there's just like tiny details that we feel, help tell the story. And we try to do storytelling through every department and everybody I feel like is really on the same page of what we're trying to say. And it's really, they worked so hard. I mean, we made this during COVID, and to be able to, so many things were closed down or not open too often, or it was a real challenge, but every department was just so awesome and worked so hard. And I really feel like it shows. So I'm really so happy that the world is getting to see their work.
Yeah. And when it comes to a lot of the moments in the script, I've heard you talk about how it was really important that everything felt really authentic and really grounded and realistic within the world of the show. And so when you have elements that allow for like a little bit of heightening, whether it's Deborah getting picked up by a helicopter from the local news station or the guy jumping out of having jumped out of the hotel room, where you allow yourself to take it to a slightly bigger scope, how did you always set about making sure that it still felt very grounded and very real to the structure of the story?
Yeah, it's kind of something where it almost like when you hear it, it like either hits you as too broad, you're just like, it's a little too broad, or can we pull it off and make it grounded and real? And does that really happen? I think that's also something that we ask ourselves, could that really happen? Does that really happen? And in terms of the guy who does in episode 105, sorry for the spoilers, does kill himself after his night out with Ava, that is a real thing that happens in Las Vegas. People go and spend all their money and before they take their lives, which is obviously very tragic. But because that is a phenomenon that happens, we felt like we could tell that story. And as for something like the helicopter, while it might not happen to you or or maybe it does, I don't know who you hang with, but
never happened. Yeah.
But it does feel like it works
Yeah.
in the world of Deborah because she would have friends in high places and low places. She would know the guy who does the local news, and she would have his number because she's run into him at a couple luncheons or galas or what have you. So yeah, we do always try to make it like, well, this is a crazy world. Like sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. But on the other hand, you do want to always to read it as truthful. And so just trying to make sure it feel like, how do you know it is? I mean, right now we're talking about season 2, and there's already things that we're like, we wish we could do that, but it just feels a little too much. So yeah, it's just kind of like how I think Paul and Jen and I kind of just feel about a particular story, and just trying to make sure it feels real. And can we justify? And if not, sorry. Yeah.
And I also wanted to ask you about the art form of writing the end of a season, because the majority of time when you're writing that final episode, and particularly those last few moments, it really has to create some sort of hook, create some open threads, but at the same time close off certain things.
Yeah.
And it also has to be able to exist if the show doesn't end up coming back for another season. So there's a lot of different intricacies that go into it. And so from all of your experience in working in television, what have you found is your approach to figuring out and navigating that final episode, and particularly the final few minutes of writing a season?
Yeah, it's definitely tricky. I think it's almost like an inverse pilot, because in the pilot you have to establish so much, but also have its own story. And in the finale, you want to like you said, tie up so many loose ends, but also have its own story. And so they tend to be longer, in my opinion. I'm like, I think they need to be a little longer. But yeah, I mean, in terms of like cliffhangers for season 2, I'm not sure it's something we'll always do. It felt right to us in terms of Ava kind of doing this 1 step forward, 2 steps back. The fact that she did send that email after a certain amount of growth she had over the season about not doing as many impulsive things. So for us, it was actually came from more character than more just like we wanted to leave people stressed out. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a matter of wanting to make sure that the season, like it feels like it has some cohesion with the beginning and the middle and the end. So you want to have that, but you also want to, like also make people feel like I want to watch another season, because that is the truth, is like you want people to be like, I need to see another season. And sometimes you still just want to see another season, even if it ends nicely and everyone's evolved, and that's great. But for us, we just feel like Ava hasn't finished evolving. She hasn't learned all the lessons she needs to learn. So she would have sent that email that does come back to haunt her. And as for Deborah, she has flown to Boston to go to Ava's dad's funeral, which, by the way, was something we had pitched is part of the original pitch. So that was already always part of how we wanted to end the season. But obviously, I don't think she's finished. She's allowed Ava in, and she's apologized, and she's gone to the funeral, and she doesn't do funerals. So we obviously have shown a certain amount of growth, but I think I would be remiss to say that she's done evolving. I think she's got a lot farther to go. So hopefully, just in the fact that we haven't taken our characters all the way to their final evolution, not that we ever end evolving, but hopefully that in and of itself would inspire people to watch more.
Yeah. Well, I'm so excited that you're already in the midst of putting season 2 together and starting to script it out, which means hopefully we'll get it very soon. But thank you so much for sharing all of this, Lucia.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure.